All right, that was Jason Blair Lewis, brother of Aaron Z. Lewis, who's with us on the call today. And we're really, really grateful for a wonderful beginning to the call. Thanks everyone for being with us for another Fireside. We are delighted to have both Aaron and Kia Kreutler here, as well as some guests from both previous kernel blocks. I see Yatu and a few other friends, Rebecca, and of course, many people in block 7 that we're really, really grateful to have. We're now at the midway point in the program, and the experience here shifts in many ways towards the ways that the past looking parts of the kernel syllabus interact with some of the future facing things that we sense might happen, or at least are worth exploring in the future of both Web3, but also in how we interact with our technologies. And both Aaron and Kia have been sources of inspiration of how memory and our futures are interrelated, and the ways in which we might use them towards healthier environments. So we'll get into that quite soon. I just want to orient the group in some sense around, where we are. We're halfway through with week 4. Week 7, we will be doing an expo, which is intended really to be an expo of both all types of things, I should say. This could be expos of adventures. It could be expos that include poetry or short stories or different types of things that you might want to share. And we're really excited to experiment with the format. So we'll be sharing more about that soon. Be on the lookout in the next day or so on just like how to sign up, how to start thinking about what you might want to expo. If you do, we'll have about 2 weeks to consider. And we'll get into that soon, but still a period of more internal direction, more of a focus than, let's say, the first few weeks of kernel and the last few weeks of kernel, which tend to be more about conversation and high energy. We are in a more reflective period. So with that, I'll pass it to Andy to take us into some of the week's materials.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to have the tunes of Bach played by Jason to lead us into this. Bach famously said, harmoniousness is next to godliness, and is quoted by a great deal of different computer scientists, particularly Hofstadter in Gödel, Escher, Bach, which one day might make its way into the kernel syllabus, but trying to summarize that particular golden thread is very difficult. So instead of doing that, I will just stick to this week's content. And last week, if you remember our conversation with Mai and Brewster, we took back the internet and we locked it open. So now that we've done that, the question is, what next? Where do we go from here? Last week's readings focused on freedom and intention, and if you go to the Converse section of the kernel website, you will find a summary of The Dawn of Everything by David Grieber and David Wengrow. What you will also find there is a response written by a kernel fellow whose name is Harold Davis III, who is under the protection of the Bear Clan, working with the Turo Wampum Group, which is a working group made up of many people within the Iroquois Confederacy, particularly the Mohawk. And Harold wrote a most beautiful response to this piece, in which he points out that many Indigenous people were not so concerned with whether they had freedom or not. That was really taken as a given in societies premised upon mutual aid. What they were primarily concerned about was, what can we do with freedom? What can we do with freedom? And this is where our explorations this week begin to point towards, and for the rest of kernel. It's, okay, we've been able to identify how bankers think about the world, to see that they too operate in the realm of complementary opposites with balance sheets or T accounts, that everything must be balanced, everything must be harmonious, but that is applied in perhaps too narrow and unimaginative a way, which is exclusionary and extractive. And recognizing this, both the power of the method, the generality of the pattern, and its particular and perhaps pathological application in narrow fields, we can then begin to look forward at, okay, what are the institutions or exstitutions? What are the roles, practices, customs, and rituals in which we can engage one another that leads to a living well together? One of the leading lights of this kind of thinking, as it applies within really quite dogmatic and prescriptive historical traditions, are the Franciscan priests, who Kia and I discussed somewhat in our Tao Guild last week, where she had mentioned the Benedictine rule. And we talked a little bit about the notion of being on the edge of the inside. The Franciscans and some orders like them were really, really interested in being able to critique coherently the traditions of which they were a part, while nevertheless remaining at least on the edge of the inside of those traditions, because they recognized that in their particular context, the church, for all of its problems, was a really useful institutional vehicle for the transference of knowledge across generations. And that the most fertile place to take within that structure was right next to the boundary, not completely outside, where one's criticisms seem to lack context, and not completely in the center, where one is not capable of changing the direction and inertia of the overall organism, but on the edge of the inside. And that's kind of some of the deeper thinking which informs the particular points that are raised in this week's module, which take a very deep look through a beautiful piece that Kia wrote on inventories, not identities. A really wonderful, and that piece, by the way, also references a really early AZL piece on identity R&D, which we will be able to discuss a little bit today too, and then moves us into wider fields that have to do with the garden of forking memes, time on the internet, memory, the ways that we experience these things can collectively come to better and more wise understandings of them. And through both a deep look at who we are and a recognition that who we are is defined always relationally, we can begin to imagine common practices, or the commons in general, which is a place that is defined by the differences of all those who share it. It's such a profound point to me. Even Illich is the one who makes this. The commons is a place that is defined by the differences of all those who share it. What an incredible and pithy way of thinking about both the beauty and the challenges that these kinds of spaces raise for us as we think about the protocols, both social and technical, that might enable us to get back toward that kind of relationality, those kinds of places to meet one another. So, Vivek, perhaps we'll take it from there.
Sure. With Kia and Aaron, it made sense to us to not put any particular titles or particular things next to their names, because there's so much that both of them have explored and have shared, and different identities ultimately that they take on. So anything that we put on paper is inevitably out of date. And I think all that I really want to say to introduce is that each of them has allowed us a wider expanse in our garden of ideas that has taken us to really like appreciating that we have a quiet garden that we are tending to and exploring, and that in and of itself can be a really healthy way to navigate. And so I want to welcome both Aaron and Kia. If either of you do have any thoughts to meander with Andy, that's always a good place to start. But we're also happy to start with a question.
Thank you for having us here. I was just showing Vivek and Andy I got my fire for the fireside. And yeah, I would love to get into any questions that you have.
Likewise, I'm happy to be here.
Amazing. It's so good to have both of you. So I think that the place where I would like to begin, and it does touch on both of your work, Kia more specifically on yours, but Erin, as I said, this relates to that old and wonderful post on identity R&D that you did. Kia, one of the quotes that I pulled in, which is most applicable to how we think about kernel, is what the narrative of self-sovereign identity misses is that identity is always inherently relational, defined in relation to environment, authority, and self. And this notion of like the relational nature of identity is such an important place to begin as we think about institutions, because no matter what kind of institution or institution we look at, it seems that people involved in that always come back to this central question of identity. Who is allowed to participate? On what grounds are they allowed to participate? What are the rules by which we construct participation based on who people are, what kinds of people we want involved, who's not at the table? All of these questions come back to identity, and yet identity then relates to all of these questions. So I would love to hear about how you think now about relational identity, having written the piece on inventories rather than identities more than a year ago. So how has thinking about relationality advanced this particular perspective on an inventory of different identities that are deployed in different circumstances toward different ends?
Sure. Yeah, so it's funny, it feels like a different age when I wrote that piece, even though it was maybe a year and a half ago, but it was kind of right before NFTs became this mainstream distraction. And one of the motivating reasons behind the piece that I think has actually become more pronounced now rather than less is that I think in kind of modernity, there's been an overconflation of property and identity. So if we conceive of kind of property as it's most often a kind of collection of different rights. So right to access, but also often the right to exclude others. And often those rights are attributed to kind of one agent, one identity or one group or entity. And I think that this kind of is actually a historical recent phenomenon rather than the kind of water or air which we breathe, which I think many take it for. And that's where a lot of the ideas of self-sovereign identity, I think, ideologically come from. So there's self-sovereign, it has a few different kind of ideological tracings. One is just the idea of having kind of self-custodial or self-sovereign, in a way, privacy or ability to choose access to your own identity. So in the crypto space, you hear like self-custodial accounts. So that's things like MetaMask, where it's ultimately, it's software that you interface with that's maintained by a team. But at its core, it's a kind of public and private key. And because you have the private key, you kind of own the public identity key. And similarly with like Gnosis Safe or multisigs, any kind of crypto account that you have access right to can be conceived as a kind of self-custodial account. So that's in opposition to something like a centralized exchange, where ultimately those funds are held in control in kind of a database of the exchange. And I think there is something genuinely kind of liberatory about this model in one way, which I'll get back to in a second, but there's also another ideological kind of bent of like coming out of kind of the sovereign individual style ideology that basically looks at kind of the individual as the agent, which will kind of overcome the state or overcome lack of freedom. And it articulates the individual as the kind of ultimate kind of broker of property, rather than a kind of it imagines that the individual could do this, as opposed to kind of more public institutions, which it presents as quite in a quite unfavorable light. And I think what I really wanted to intervene with was the idea of, well, if we think differently about kind of, if we hold less loosely to kind of like the property as identity, if we think about them as kind of relational inventories, because ultimately in the sovereign individual, you will always be articulated and defined in relation to the relationships you have with others, your relationship to the space that you're in, your relationship to institutions and exstitutions. And that's actually, there is a truth that's true to you, but that's always defined in your situatedness. And so I really wanted to write the piece to bring that forth. And I think I really appreciated Andy when you brought in Ivan Illich for this module, because I think that his work kind of really clearly denotes a way in between these, where Illich's work often thinks of basically how we can have different forms of technology or property that don't alienate us from our function. So in the way that technology should increase agency rather than institutionalize it. So it's a way of both kind of having identity be relational, community oriented, and not intermediated by the idea of kind of static property, and not intermediated by the idea of only institutional or kind of non-self-custodial either. Yeah, so I think just wanting to define how we think of ourselves online differently, so that we can like come to embody in the world more differently, like a political agency, and really conceive of us as like agents not restricted to our ability to invoke property rights.
Yeah, and I think this conflation between property and identity that Kia is speaking about shows up often in the way that we talk about Web3 and ownership of identity, because often there's this conflation between the data that you produce and you own and your own identity and your ability to move that data across different platforms. So there's this assumption that because you can move your data, your identity is more free or mobile, but underneath that idea is this conflation that that Kia is speaking to, which is that between data or our modern conception of property, like your data is something that you own, and who you are. And this model of data as identity sort of ignores the ground of your identity, whether it's the relationality that Kia is talking about, or even the more infrastructural qualities, the stack that the self sits on, from the built environment to the food to the water supply, and the more fully embodied aspects that the identity layer sits on top of.
One of the things that this brings up for me is, in thinking about law, and particularly our legal relationships to property, David Grieber and David Wengro make the points that most of them are based upon the Roman law notions of usus, abusus, and fructus. So, as Kia said, this is not the water within which we swim. It's a fairly recent phenomena. And the point that they make is, in particular, so usus, abusus, and fructus, the right to use, abuse, and benefit from. And those three things tend to define ownership, broadly speaking, in our current legal frameworks. And what I hear from Kia is that the non-custodial control of a key is a really healthy way of enabling individual agency, balanced by the fact that software has to be maintained by a team of people often, and that there is this kind of public good or commons-based aspect of it, which allows for us to think about really interesting ways of balancing harmoniously the individual agency that our tools should enable while being common public spaces. the problem with abuses, which Wengro and Grieber really identify as that idea which imports into our domestic scenes, into this stack on which the self sits, the most inherent kinds of violence can perhaps be attended to. But what I really want to just pull out here, and Aaron, to you first, is the notion of fructus. Like what benefit really means, right? Because like Illich, when he's talking about the commons, he says, commons on, on it's used in so many different ways that it can't be encoded in law. So the shepherd comes to lie underneath the shade of the oak tree on weekdays, and the acorns go to the widow in town who lost her husband to like the seasonal influenza that went through the town. And on Sundays, the church uses the tree to gather underneath. And there are all of these, like by custom, established uses of the commons, ways in which people can benefit, fructus, that are so complex that they can't be reduced to law. And I know that you've been doing a lot of gardening recently, and that you have some thoughts about fruit in generally the actual fruits. I mean, not just the Roman legal notion of fructus. And I wonder, like how can we think about that aspect? Because it relates so deeply to how we identify in the world and the different personas that we can adopt in different spaces as we do this R&D with who we are and who we are in relationship to other people.
Yeah. Well, for context, I am here in Washington, D.C., and I help to steward and do the programming for a garden park space in my neighborhood, which is like about the size of a city block or so. And we, as we do a lot of gatherings and event design and programming that really aims to bring the neighborhood together around shared interests and workshops and classes and curiosities, I've learned a lot about this this notion of the commons through trying to start up this project, this local gathering space. And what's really interesting to see is kind of there's sort of a front end to the garden, which is the experiences and events that people come and enjoy, and the landscape design and farming that they do there. And then there's also the backstage, which is more of the operations. And the project is stewarded by a nonprofit neighborhood association, which has its own committee and governance structure. So I've been involved in the sort of day-to-day beauty of just enjoying the commons, but also the operational piece and what does it look like to make decisions as a committee and to set up clear roles and clear processes for allocating our resources and our budget and all these kinds of things. And I think what's been really interesting to see is like the garden energy can oftentimes be very different than the governance energy, right? But they sort of need each other because the governance energy provides that structure and that sense of smooth operations and that sense of everyone in the neighborhood being able to have a say in what kind of things can happen in the space. And then the garden energy is where you can just chill and enjoy and relax and taste the fruits of your labor. And what's been cool to see with the committee structure, as Andy's kind of describing, there's all kinds of things that just happen organically, naturally, behaviors that emerge, patterns that emerge in terms of how people want to use the space, what people are excited about doing there. And a lot of the actual committee work is sort of looking in a rearview mirror to codify and formalize these patterns that are sort of emerging on their own. So oftentimes, for example, if we want to, do a new genre of event where we want to get budget allocated to host a gallery exhibition for a neighbor's photo works. We've never done this kind of event before, but there's lots of interest from neighbors who want to come, who want to participate, who want to share their artworks. Taking that, bringing it to the more formal structures, getting it approved that way, having those processes in place by which the organic energy can become a little more codified also makes it more accessible and open to others who want to do things with us. So you don't have to, have a special relationship or know somebody to make something happen. That little bit of formality, though it can sometimes feel awkward, is actually the affordance that people need to get involved if they're not already like in the know.
Yeah, that's wonderful. This notion of the affordances that are necessary for like organic energy to grow along the vine, but then have surprising and nourishing results that one cannot predict is really interesting. And Kia, it leads me to like another point. Broadly speaking, in your work, I think that it's a thematic strand, but it does also come out in inventories, even if it feels like it's from a different era, which is the notion of like these places need to be arenas in which we can have conversations, with ourselves about like who we are and how we present in any given moment, but then also the affordances which allow us to enter into like healthy conversation with one another, not mediated by some particular like bureaucratically institutional framework. And I wonder, like, yeah, how are you thinking about conversation, especially as it relates to like this kind of the protocol energy and the poetic energy, or like the governance process and the organic growth? Where are the conversations that you've had recently which relates to this?
Right. That makes sense in kind of calling out the tension between those like highly formalized zones and more informal zones. And I think also kind of with the garden space, the garden front ends and the kind of operations, like what I think is key to kind of bridging these is a kind of aliveness. And I would say the key is a kind of activeness and adaptability. So I think there's one kind of technical frame that could see identity as basically the ability to act, or like in your piece, the ability to sign. So identity becomes kind of basically performing an action rather than a kind of static identity, which is identified within a bureaucratic framework and then operationalized from there, but something that is able to kind of, let's say back to like Judith Butler or something, but kind of being able to perform. So being able to sign with your private key, or being able to attest that in your peer circle, certain kind of relationships exist or certain kind of contributions have been made. And it's that ability to kind of act that I think is really key to not having these regimes become too strict. Because there is a way in which basically all digital identity systems or reputation systems are traps, especially when they're public and universal. And I like two more points on this. One is that I think in terms of thinking about activity, I often think about I think it's Keith Johnstone, although I always say it wrong, so it's some variation of that. His book called Improv, which actually talks about kind of the theater, and basically how a lot of things in theater and improvisation, often what makes a kind of skit or improv act funny is people switching status. So someone playing high status and someone playing low status, and those two people interacting, but then switching and someone saying something kind of high status and then low status, and really playing with the mutability of a relationality. So, and I always call DAOs like heterarchic in the sense that they can be organized in different ways rather than strictly hierarchical or non-hierarchical. So it's this kind of activity and playfulness of identity that I think needs to be preserved. Oh, there was one more thing and now I'm forgetting it. But yeah, to me, it's very much like identity is always mutable in some way. So when we're thinking about immutable systems, it's very important to preserve that feeling of aliveness.
I love that Kia brings in impro here. because there's also a lot in there about mask work and the different masks that we wear, and that Keith Johnstone has his students do in the improv workshops to experiment with what different masks draw out of you, what aspects of your identity different masks highlight. And something that we've been experimenting with a lot lately in the garden, which is very inspired by Yatu and Teal Process, who's on the call right now. We have these construction vests that we got after we saw Yatu using construction vests at the factory, which is a workshop space in New York. But the idea is on Saturdays when we have our volunteer hours, we whip out the construction vests, and they're basically a costume that allow people to enter into a shared identity space, a shared headspace, a shared sense of, you know, we're all building here together, we're in construction mode. And when other people walk by, when neighbors walk through the alley and they look and they see, oh, what's going on there? You have a costume that serves as an affordance for what's going on for what it means to enter into that space. So the way that the clothing can be an external expression of the role or the identity that you're wearing at any given moment becomes a really powerful affordance for what people are invited to do in this space. And the other thing related to this that I've been really nerding out on lately is Robert's rules, which if you don't know, is basically a structured conversational procedure, a parliamentary procedure that's used by nonprofit groups, governments. If you ever hear someone say like, you know, I move a motion, seconded, you know, all in favor say aye. It's sort of this conversational procedure. And I've been thinking of Robert's rules as a kind of like linguistic costume, or a language that you can wear as a group or committee, a linguistic infrastructure that allows you to sort of wear a process and make the game of making decisions together kind of this like fun theatrical thing where you're sort of like, it's a little silly, but it's also very powerful in the sense that you are inheriting a linguistic tradition that's been used by decision-making bodies to make decisions for a long time. And in trying on that language, you're actually able to depersonalize the role. You're able to speak to the other people in the group as their role rather than as the individual that happens to be in the role at this point in time. And when you can speak to the role instead of the individual person who happens to be wearing the role right now, some really powerful communication possibilities unlock.
Yeah, and I think those are both really good examples. One, just in terms of Robert's rules as a kind of role that you're able to try on, and also kind of costume or clothing as a kind of ability to act. And that was a lot of kind of what I wanted to get at with the inventories, not identities piece, in the sense that kind of designing technical or socio-technical systems that conceive of identity as a form of clothing rather than as a form of being. And I think something we can try on, try off allows us to perform a role that's legible or sometimes illegible to the degree that we want it to be. And I also think I like clothing because, you know, there's the property example, but I think for a lot of us, clothing is a much more like mutable and movable form of property than other forms. Like you'll very easily let someone borrow a sweater. You'll very easily kind of move stuff around or give it away or get more. It's much more fluid than a lot of, I think, other property regimes. So if we can, and often, you know, the kind of paradigm of costumes of something like, it's always like the kind of dusty costume room. It's something that's kind of carried over like generations and is inherited almost like institutionally that you have to make do with. So I love both of those examples as kind of roles and how, and really I think the basis through which we should conceive of like when we build informal identity systems to make sure that they have that looseness and changeability.
I think something that Kia, you would especially love is I remember when I was in Sydney, there's a museum of the first peoples, and something I saw there was the Aboriginals peoples in that area. They made these giant blankets, and the blankets would basically like tell the story of like a particular person or leader's life and their relationship to the landscape. And the blanket will get passed down from generation to generation, so that the descendants could literally wrap themselves in the stories of their ancestors. And I think that's such a cool artifact or example of like, you know, a story or identity that you wear, but also intergenerationally across time.
Love that, yeah.
It's beautiful. That's really beautiful. This question may seem a little trite after such an incredible sharing, but Kia, I would like to ask, do you then think, as soon as we started this with Bach, do you think that there is such a thing as like performative keys in Web3? Can we like have like keys that change places and allow us to try on roles and act in agentic ways, and those keys move around from person to person as the need may be? And if so, how?
Well, I think a lot of what we're finding now, and it's kind of very much the like always has been meme, is that it's really important to kind of ground these practices in places. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a kind of shared physical place, but there has to be some sort of kind of connection between these people who are doing these experiments, rather than focusing on just the experiment and just the online version itself. So I think a lot of that kind of, the key is set through like all these kind of informal clues and informal ways of making a space. Like I would say like kernel has several keys that it kind of plays in. And a lot of that tone is established by the community, both in all of the kind of blocks, but also the previous blocks, and the fact that people come in and kind of continue the story of the blanket. So I think a lot of it is just relationally setting the tone and making it clear how people can build on that tone. That is so important. I think we tend to kind of fetishize the voting process, and it's very, very hard to kind of play a note through like an online voting system. That texture is missing. So there has to be a whole kind of scaffolding around that in order to create something that unlocks that feeling.
Incredible. Levels of metaphor woven into that particular response are just absolutely heart-opening for me in so many ways. Thank you. And it links to something really beautiful that you have written, which gets us even deeper into this garden as place. And you quote Louise Driller, who wrote that there are as many internet architectures as there are users. Each of our clicks serves to sculpt the internet according to our own image. We're transitioning from a world of linear narratives and timelines to a garden of forking memes that we're free to explore and to tend to. The gardening games with the richest environments, the deepest stories, and the most interesting characters will attract the most people. And I love the plurality of this quote, and I love your own play with richest environments, especially as it relates to these layers of stories, these layers of memory, these keys and notes and textures and roles and improvisations and ways in which they can all be woven together into something which allows at once for me to be who I truly am, and for those with whom I relate to find, you know, a great sense of cohesion or coherence or symphonic resonance. So I wonder if you have some thoughts about this play with richest environments and how we get to those places together. literally places.
Yeah. Yeah, something I love that that I heard Kia mention once is this idea of bringing a feeling of site specificity to the internet or to digital spaces. I think Kernel does a really good job of that. You know, we're on a Zoom call right now. Many of us are in many Zoom calls every day, and yet with the energy and tone and texture that you bring here, you have a way of making Zoom feel site specific, which I would have thought was impossible, but I think you've made it happen really nicely. Another thing that I've been working with a lot, both in my own context and also in conversation with Kia and her ideas, is the ways in which the most successful stories become environments, the ways that we actually encode and incarnate the stories that are most meaningful into the landscapes that we build, the landscapes that we create. I live in DC, as I mentioned, and the National Mall is basically like a giant memory palace to America's civic religion. This story that, you know, became so powerful that the literally entire city is designed around its axis. And you go to the monuments and you experience like the architecture of the way this environment was set up. It's set up to tell a story. And our main goal with the garden project here has been to build in a way that allows us to reveal and remember the history of our particular context, our locality, our neighborhood. So a lot of the project has been around not just, you know, setting up gatherings and events for people to enjoy in the present, but also design the space and the interfaces to the space and some of the architectural affordances in the space in a way that actually serves as a portal to the past and allows people to feel very emplaced, like a deep sense of where they are, given what they can learn about the neighborhood and its history and its past through the various affordances that we've set up in the garden. And I think that feeling of site specificity and that feeling of the landscape connecting you to a story that is not only, you know, an abstract narrative of what's happened in the past, but also then becomes something that you're implicated in and invited into to participate in our now, which comes from the thread of the past that we've painted. That's just for me, a new and really energizing way of relating to place that I've really enjoyed also sharing with the neighbors.
So beautiful. I just want to relate, because Aaron, I don't know if I've told this to you or to Kia, but one of the threads for Kernel for me was a program called Titans, which I was in my last year of university. And it was one of, for me, the transformative learning experiences that just like changed the way I was able to move through the world. And there's actually a Houston Titans dinner that I'm going to this evening that'll have about 150 Titans that will go, and it's a very big, grand name for the program that Britt, who is the professor, bestowed upon us. But the reality that always changed it for me was that I ended up going to 4 weddings of people that I was in Titans with, and I met their parents, and I danced with their friends, and they became my friends. And the way that time moved changed practically, right? Like my sense of time became more ecological, even though this was technically a finance program deep in the belly of what moves markets. And somehow it wasn't, right? It was something different. And these words are also in that post. There's, we are time travelers now, and we might as well figure out how to imbue our digital clocks with a more ecological, human readable sense of time. And it was never Brit's intention for Titans to be a DAO or to even be anything related to technology. He kind of begrudgingly used email to keep us all together. But this like site specificity, it's a beautiful phrase because it imbued like a particular little pocket of the world with a particular spirit and trusted that that was enough, that it didn't need to like go too many other places, that would happen as is. I'd love to welcome other voices. Andy, if you feel it's a good time, there are some questions that have made their way into the Slido, but we're always open to hearing them out loud. So if you'd like to raise hand, unmute, and share, we can shift into the meandering portion. Let's see. While people decide there, I'll just use the Slido as a beginning. There are 6 or 7 questions already there. Perhaps, Jake, if you'd be willing, given you're the only one not anonymous, we could start with your question if you'd like to unmute. And I see we have Charles as well. Jake, please, why don't we start with you?
What I get for using my identity.
Brave soul.
So I guess one of the things that I think a lot about with identity is that, and we kind of touched upon this, but that that there's part of it that's sort of inherently coercive in that like people want to define who they are, but a critically important part of identity is really its gatekeeping function and the ability of other groups to determine whether or not they want to interact with you or engage with you or legally can engage with you or whether you're safe for their community. And so a thing that I kind of think a lot about is how do we, what kind of framework can we use to determine where the kind of coercive aspects of identity are important and where the expression aspects of identity are important? And are there cases where we want to be able to offer part of one and not the other? Are there cases where somebody should be able to kind of get a true false response to is this person safe without getting kind of the total details? Like what is a framework we can use for determining how to build that identity? And I suppose also, are those actually just two totally separate functions? Like is identity grouping different things that actually could be separate? Like, is this person safe versus like, does this person like to bake? You know, are those the same thing?
Sure. I think that's a really important question because I think that the main role of governance within communities that I actually see, to be really honest, is keeping abusive actors unable to take over the resources, whether it's the emotional resources or the actual resources. And I think crypto does a really bad job of this at the moment, despite having a quite immutable identity system. Well, obviously it's not Sybil resistant, the identity system, but still there's a kind of publicness and mutability to it. But I also think at the same time, in the same way that it's a historical circumstance that we've conflated identity with property, I think we're also in a kind of actually only in the last 50 years with the idea that you basically have to have some sort of universal public identity system in order to have things like accountability and provision. I think it is actually a much different and potentially better approach. I think it depends on the level of accountability and the level of the publicness of the organization or the identities involved. There's the kind of old adage of like basically privacy for the vulnerable, accountability and transparency for the powerful. Of course, the terms of how you define that and how you institute that are other. But basically that you can have kind of almost like a peer-to-peer, more web of trust looking like identity systems. So you could have something, ideally it would be private, but there would be kind of attestations of like more central nodes in a given network are basically trusted nodes. And that there would be a way to be able to basically enforce accountability within a specific context, rather than necessitating that it be on the basis of a kind of very public identity. So on a technical level, there's a few different web of trust implementations. Recently, there's like Circles UBI and a few other things related to crypto. But ideally, you could have context-dependent accountability and not have the need to this be tied to kind of like a public universal reputation system. And I think that a lot of those terms have to be set by the explicit community. And I hope that like it's also difficult because pseudonymity and also just the universality of crypto makes this pattern very difficult. So I hope that as more communities prototype kind of working with the accountability of inventories rather than identities, some of these patterns will prove successful and propagate over time to the more kind of universal space that something like Ethereum as a public ledger exists in.
I'll also offer a thought here, which is that how do we implement context-specific accountability in media which merge the economic with the like technical propagation of messages? And I think that the most like readily accessible solution, certainly the easiest to understand, is economically. And so you see that already in like proof of stake systems with the notion of like having value at stake, which gets slashed in the case of malicious behavior defined to be many different things based on our understanding of how systems operate, whether that's like you going offline, you not being able to participate in consensus, or submitting bad states, where bad state again has various specific technical connotations and particular kinds of economic penalties. And like I struggle to talk about this in public fora because immediately when you like try and link the economic and the question of identity, it sounds like I'm advocating for the hyper-financialization of everything and the fetishization of voting, which is definitely not what I'm trying to put forward here. But when I think about like identity and economic media, even the notion of like nodes in the trusts in like webs of trust is an interesting one for me, because we have Philip Sheldrake in Kernel, and he's always talking about identity is immanent in relationships, which are immanent in information exchange. And what he means by that is that like who we are is defined by all of the people that we're around, and the shape of the network that we participate in informs the kind of relationships we can have, and therefore the kind of identity that we're capable of performing, right? And that's fascinating to me because like what he's saying is like it's not just the like links between nodes, the institutional view, nor is it the nodes themselves, the institutional view, that the nodes themselves also have like this whole stack that Aaron spoke about, which has to do with the improvisation and performance of different personas as different masks are put on us in different contexts. And like that to me, it's so fascinating because like if you can think of like your identity as a key that you play in some kind of musical symphony, and that those keys can be exchanged also like perhaps according to like economic criteria, and that then the keys are held accountable according to like similarly well-defined economic criteria that then allows for context-specific accountability, I think is like a genuinely interesting way of implementing this stuff, so long as it goes along with like the cultural precedents that act against hyper-financialization. I hope I've been able to express some of that, because I'm very nervous about saying some of these things because I don't want to be misinterpreted and make it all about money, which is very specifically not what I mean.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about voter identification and all that's required, even in a democratic society, to prove that you have enough stake, residence, citizenship in a place in order for your vote to count, or for you to have a vote. With these early governance experiments in a digital context, the sort of voter identification requirements, quote unquote, are are very very minimal, right? Because all you need in a lot of cases to have a stake is to just have a token. So as we try to expand these mechanisms into new contexts and use cases, it'll be interesting to see sort of what constitutes enough of a stake or residence in the community in order to have a say beyond just the holding of a governance token.
Yeah, and I want to speak briefly to a point that came up in the chat about kind of not going too far, because there's certain things like dissolving ego, closes identity, and depersonalization that have historically trended towards totalitarian society, where you have to kind of wear a role or wear clothes. I guess, I can see that historical example, but I also think a lot of the kind of context that I'm speaking out from, we might be speaking from, is in the context of blockchains with public transactions, organizations with public votes. And that's like, if we look at that and as a kind of identity system and regime, and as soon as we start getting like a really kind of close coupling of one's identity with one's address, or kind of one's kind of previous transactions with oneself, and really identify that with one person, then we have basically the worst surveillance machine ever built. So in wanting to kind of introduce this flexibility of action and self, I'm wanting to kind of keep the cultural space in time for things like more private transactions and blockchains that are less public to come about, so that we don't fall into the trap of basically building the worst thing ever. So I can get where the historical examples of saying like, oh, it's closed, it's not you, de-identification is important. But I think in the context of this like socio-technical system, it's incredibly important that we preserve distance from our public online actions, because the reverse of that is much more fascistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when I talk about centering the role instead of the individual, I'm talking about in a very specific governance context. So for example, like what makes Congress function as a democratic body or polity, at least in theory, is you're electing representatives to positions, and individuals move in and out of those elected positions. So that's what allows the governance system to be more than just, the whims of any given individual or family or set of personal relationships. And it's not about dissolving ego, like in terms of like the way that I or a governance participant relates throughout the course of their entire life or all of their social relationships. It's really just the field of play, the game board that is those governance spaces where decisions are made by elected officials, and allowing that process to be one that's open, so that unlike a monarch or a king or an autocrat or something, I can actually be elected into the chair, the position, the role, as opposed to being really tightly coupled with a specific individual.
Yeah. On that note, I wanted to offer the floor to Liv, if willing. The quote, the wisdom from the grandmother, the loose garments, but anything else that's been touching you in this conversation.
Yeah, there's just like wildly similar points to 12-step programs. I don't know, obviously it's an anonymous program. This is like AA, NA, all the A's. But I just find it fascinating because wearing the program like a loose garment is something that's said. And then when I did research on it, I found out that it's like an old biblical saying that's been passed down from, like a lot of like American Southern people say it. And it's more so like, there's another saying, take what you want and leave the rest, in terms of like, don't constrict yourself so heavily with like enforced procedures. But also the reflection between like the anonymity and protection from bad actors in AA, or NA, whatever, there's a huge problem of predatory sexual abuse towards new people. So like how does a decentralized group that has no leader protect people from that? What, and then there's governance procedures put in place. When does it override? When do we step out of this constructed governance to intervene in something that's like serious, especially towards marginalized people? There's problems in AA of people of color not being treated with respect and therefore feeling unwelcome, or queer people, or it depends on where you live and where you go to meetings, but I don't know. And then there's like no real leader. And then I was thinking like, well, of course, Ethereum has Vitalik and AA has Bill Wilson, who's like this old dude from the 1940s who made AA. But I guess like the point is like 12-step programs have existed for 80 plus years now and have helped millions of people and not hurt many. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced some stuff, but it's overwhelmingly been positive and no profit, no payment, completely anonymous. So like, what can we learn from that? And I think like sort of repeating that, wearing it like a loose garment, because also last point of this is, individual meetings are sort of like DAOs within a larger ecosystem. So like if a meeting is toxic, you can even make your own. It only takes 2 people to make a meeting. That's what they say in AA or NA. You can go to another one. You can try and say, I make a motion to change this and this, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just not your bag. Like sometimes people are just not cool and you leave that meeting. So I don't know. I just found it really, really, really interesting. A lot of reflection on that.
Yeah. If I may offer the floor, if Maya, if you have anything, because I know you have to go soon, in continuation of that thought.
Yeah, Liv, I loved your take on that. I feel like I pull a lot as well from communities who have historically had to form it in a more decentralized fashion, and who really value anonymity and also preserving safety. And that's kind of where, my follow-up question leads. Would love to know, Key, your take on it. In communities where protecting privacy and protecting identity and anonymity is paramount, yet you want to have the ability to trace or communicate or use blockchain's public record or sometimes even private records as a source of truth to offer services in this community. What's kind of the best blend of how to evaluate that trade-off? I'm coming from a place of like trying to build a product that establishes basically like a record of truth and ownership over content and images, created by people in the sex work industry or people surrounding the sex work industry and content creators on OnlyFans, et cetera. And one of the things that I feel like we're running into is the more we put on chain, the more, at least on a public chain, the more we open this community up to exploitation, which we don't want to do. And so I'm really curious to know kind of how you evaluate that trade-off.
Yeah, totally. I think it's always that thing of, privacy for the vulnerable, but it's often you have to negotiate that privacy in the context of the power surrounding you. So are you going to be able to take that privacy? And that becomes a really important question. I think I'll answer like specifically in thinking about the role of crypto, because you mentioned you're building a product. Like of recent months with a lot of the stuff that's happened, I'm just kind of like full base layer privacy on blockchain. Like the transactions should be private by default. And it's a little bit of a panacea, presented as a panacea at the moment because it's not implemented, and we'll see how it goes when they're really in use. But the kind of zero knowledge proof or shielded transactions, and that you can basically confirm that an action happens without having to reveal the kind of nature or identity behind that action. I think in the shorter term, basically thinking about building the kind of reputation or trust system or provenance system, maybe like one layer higher above base layer privacy. So if you assume that like the kind of service you would provide is that provenance that links back to like a timestamp, but maybe no more than that, feels like a good approach to me. And having that provenance being able to be revealed if needed, but not public by default. Feels like the right user affordance there.
Beautiful.
Yes, I'm nodding vigorously. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. I wonder if we may go down a couple of other threads. One in the Slido is perhaps one best for Aaron. Please highlight any digital gardening patterns which are the same or similar to some physical gardening patterns. Perhaps that could be a fun one for a moment.
Oh, that's a good question. I have to think for a second.
Sure.
I mean, I think gardens in general are a very fruitful metaphor for creative process. And so you see it used a lot around things like people talk about digital gardening as it relates to sort of watering a set of ideas that they have that they're trying to like grow in public on a blog space, sort of, you know, move away from like knowledge management to knowledge gardening is something that we've seen a lot of. I also have seen a lot of it in the governance context that I've worked in, the way people describe the practice of building a community of practice around a tool or a protocol or ecosystem as a kind of gardening. And I really think this is maybe like a very specific example, but something I've noticed as like so much work moves into spaces like Fig Jam or Miro or these sort of like infinite canvas tools, a lot of the questions around like how to work digitally with a group become very architectural because the workspace is so spatial. And when you open up infinite canvas software, you're presented with this sort of blank screen. And if the cursors are like the bodies, the digital bodies of all the people who are participating in a kind of jam session or a meeting inside of the board, then you sort of have to think architecturally in terms of how to design that space for the gathering that you're trying to host or facilitate. And what's very, you know, clear from gardening and learning about landscape architecture is that the way you architect the space or lay it out has a huge influence on the way people relate to one another in that space, the social affordances of the space, and what kind of interactions are possible. So thinking a lot about basically the architectural qualities and the pattern languages that we make for the virtual workspaces that we set up and inhabit in our little cursor bodies.
I love cursor bodies and your use of the word affordances. Andy, go ahead, please.
There's also something here, which is that, you know, like Liv and Maya have really beautifully highlighted the fact that like a lot of the discussions that we tend to have about identity governance, these kinds of things, exist in like the abstracted digital world, and like inevitably always come back to the facticity of this body, like this white male body, that other different kind of body, which systems don't tend to like be built for. And there is a really interesting like dynamic in that, which is applicable to the garden, right? In the sense that like when I pay very particular attention to my body, and in like meditative frames of mind or ecstatic dance, or through the fact of having to deal with an addiction, all of these are like ways of interrogating the reality of the body, the embodied nature of it, the incarnate reality is what Aaron called it earlier, which is so true. And it leads to a deeper sense of identity and a deeper sense of play that can be enacted in both physical and digital space, because it highlights a certain pattern or a certain like way of being, a certain quality, which then enables playfulness irrespective of the space. And the same thing for me, and this is what I find so beautiful about Aaron's writing, is like the same thing applies to gardening, is that like, yes, there's metaphorical or analogies that we can draw between like digital gardening and actionable gardening, but also like garden. Just garden, actually garden, like go and like plant something. You don't have to do a whole city block like Aaron's doing if it's not your thing, but like plant some rosemary in a pot outside your window, like do something. And then you will begin to see that like it's the frame of mind, right? Like there's the sense of like being in the garden, which is not just about leisure. There's also like a seasonality to it. There's also a particular kind of attention. You have to know when to sow and when to harvest, what quality soil to use, how to maintain it, how to cycle plants through, how to plant companion plants, you know, like nasturtiums go really well with basil, which supports tomatoes, and like these things. And then you got some beans in there because they fix nitrogen in the soil. And like, okay, cool. Like there's like very particular frames of mind that can then apply in a broader analogical context to the way that you interact with any knowledge online, irrespective of like the spatial architecture of the places that you're in. It's like, if you grow something, then you can apply the lessons that you learn there to how you grow stuff online, broadly speaking. And that to me is like a critical.
Yeah, I really like something Sarah Perry says, which is that digital space, cyberspace is not disembodied, it's just differently embodied, and the body is revealed or configured in a different way. So still with all these, you know, networks and systems that want to kind of pretend to disclude or exclude physical body, remembering that it's of course still there, even if not represented in the map. And then also, as you say, when it comes to gardening, it's really about enculturing and nurturing a certain quality of attention and a certain relationship to the way that processes unfold over time. We have like really intimate relationships with these, you know, glass rectangles that we stare into for so many hours a day, and that inculcates a certain mode of attention, a certain style of attending to the world. And similarly, when you're in relationship to a landscape or implicated in the liveliness of a landscape, it also changes the mode of attention in ways that are not really linguistic, but sensory. And you can learn about it by doing it.
Beautiful. I want to welcome either Yatu, who seemed to be quite excited about the idea of these digital gardens and architectures. Yatu, if you have anything you'd like to share or explore there, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for the space. Whether I have thoughts, I think that's like, I have many of them. I think the biggest issue here is me being able to distill them to the best one. But I visited recently the garden in DC, and we were able to chat with one of Aaron's friends, not one of my friends as well, who's a landscape architect, a professor, and some takeaways I've been able to that were really meaningful were ones in which the perspective in which we enjoy the space is like how we probably should design the space. So I often recalled Aaron mentioning like a lot of times people get a drone or, you know, design from the top up view of how something should be arranged, when really like walking through the space and relating on how something should be shaped and formed by that mode is much more in tune with what feels right than like drawing rectangles of where things should be. And I found that very, it's been a recurring thought that weighs really heavy. Another thing is understanding the the patterns that exist in a space. There's like a famous book called like Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, but I think a lot of us here are responsible for making new patterns with emerging technology. And I think that being able to recognize that we all are in a position where we can create new patterns digitally and physically is something I think I would just encourage all of us to reflect a bit on, because like that's a lot of like where meme culture comes from and all that, right? Where like how fast a sense or a thought gets propagated by a meme is a pattern. And as we build things, as we contribute towards things, and as we engage with processes, protocols, and shape them and partake and contribute, kind of like what Tia was talking about, like, she's developing her stance of how she thinks things should be moving forward, even with like privacy. Like, I think these are all moments in which we're taking time to reflect on like the implications of establishing patterns and contributing towards them, or even moving away from them. So I think that's the best like little like nugget I can like take from my mind right now in this context, in a visual form. I mean, not a visual form, auditorial form.
Yeah, and pretty much all the best things I know about the ecological sensibility I learned from my partner Josh Morin, who's also on the call here and can speak a lot better to this question of gardening and what we can learn from the kind of attention we pay to landscapes and our local ecosystems.
Seems like Josh may have had to go, but it's beautiful. And I hope that we can spend some more time with him, just interrogating him for all that he may share. I wanted to offer also, I know we have Marvin Lin here from Gnosis Guild. I know we have some other folks who have especially made time. So if you would like to unmute, if you have anything, please feel free. I also wanted to make sure to pass the mic to Sister Tebebwa, if Sister you're willing. I know you've been sharing quite a bit in the chat, so please feel free and we'll move from there.
Greetings of love and light and peace and darkness. So the rain caught me. I was out on the beach running and listening to this, and the rain caught me, so I ran all the way home. I give so much thanks once again for the speakers and what they're bringing. There's so many different threads. As I was saying in the chat, like, yes, so much of our identity, I love the idea of it, wearing it as a clothing, because we change identity as we grow. Every time we learn something new, when we're interacting with different people, different parts of our identity comes out. So it's never a stable, a static thing. And it's something that where we I love the idea of wearing it loosely and passing it down, because that knowing that so much of who we think we are is actually comes down through the bloodlines as well as through the spiritual ancestors. Secondly, I was wanting to reason about the garden and about the focus. Like the more we focus on our garden, the more our garden focuses on us. And so it would be the same within community. It's literally, you know, focusing on each other, you know, being present as you teach, you know, in the kernel is in the listening and being present. Yeah, also the patterns, the permaculture patterns, there's eternal patterns that when we align ourselves to those patterns, everything kind of flows more freely. So give thanks and praise. I know there's lots of other people who also want to come in, so I'm going to jump off.
Thank you, sister. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Blue caught one beautiful quote. The more we focus on our garden, the more our garden focuses on us. Thank you, sister. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, anyone else who has questions, thoughts? Probably have time for one more. Or Aaron and Kia, if you have anything there.
I have a quick announcement. Maybe I can just plug this very relevant event that I'm organizing. That's not quite yet, but very soon on the Junto calendar. It's the November 1st, save the date, noon Pacific time, 8 p.m. Central Europe. That's the week of the wonky clocks. It's about community wisdom gardening. So there was a question before about like what beyond money. Well, I'm thinking a lot about wisdom and sort of even beyond the collective intelligence. We'll have Howard Reingold with us. We'll have Tom Atlee, Colonel Mentor George Poor will be there, and a few other surprises. I don't want to say more because they're still coming in. Excited, and just everybody's welcome, and the information's coming soon.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you. Thank you.
I would actually love to read a little quote from an interview with Illich to maybe kind of give a closing note that I think is really important. Is that all right?
Beautiful. Yes.
Please.
So it's an impartial quote because I just have a photo of the book. But I think that it doesn't necessarily relate to our talk as much, but more kind of just like the broader Web3 system and how we should think about kind of, you know, what is the type of agency and autonomy and relationality we want? Because as we introduce more and more tokens and tokenization and kind of paradigms around identity and static forms, like potentially we actually intermediate and decrease our relationality even more. So it's like, how can you think about technology that maybe doesn't? And I thought this passage, it will be kind of a non sequitur, but this passage kind of really moved me to think about systems that don't result in this type of mediation. So he's talking about the kind of issue with equality, and basically that this was like about 30 years ago, I think shortly before he passed, like late 80s. And already, and he mentions, it's cut off, but something about kind of like at this time, 65% of the world had the kind of bottom half of the wealth. Obviously now that disparity is much worse. And he says, what worries me most about that is not the disparity as such, but the fact that 65% can no longer live as they could 30 years ago without recourse to money. Then many things were still not monetized or monetarized. Subsistence still was functioning. Today, they can't move without buying a bus ticket. They can't get heat in their kitchen by collecting wood, but instead have to buy electricity. And how to explain this kind of evil? So to me, the answer to this isn't money's bad, we don't need money, but how can we have forms of value exchange that don't create further mediation between people and their environments, but kind of allow people to use it as a useful tool when it's needed and to cast it away when it's not. It's just something I would like to impart as all of you kind of go on to work on like projects and tokenization and other things. How does it increase subsistence rather than decrease it?
Aaron, any final thoughts you might want to share?
I think that's a beautiful note to end on.
Yeah. Kia, thank you. Aaron, you as well. Thank you so much. It really is a pleasure. Feels like a walk into a very alternate form of time, and one that I'm grateful to be in. So yeah. Andy, anything else from you?
I love Kia's question. I would encourage all of us to keep it on our minds. And Illich wrote another text called The Celebration of Awareness, in which he writes, and you can find it in linked in Aaron's essay in Kernel. He writes, each one of us and each of the groups with which we live and work must become a model of the era we desire to create. The many models which will develop should give to each one of us an environment in which we celebrate our creative response to change with others who need us. Thank you so much for both joining us. I need you, Kia and Aaron and Vivek, and it's such a delight to celebrate the time we have together in this environment.
Thank you. Yes. Look for ways to let the landscape think through you and with you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. We'll end with some Jason Blair Lewis. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Kernel's my favorite. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.